Good evening, members, guests, teachers, and students. My name is Sandia Bayou, and I am Director of Development at the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. It's our hope that you and your families are staying healthy. We are so glad you joined us today. And I want to invite all of you to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can watch all of our recently recorded as well as some of our upcoming programming. Now, more than ever, it's important to stay informed about what is happening not only in our city, but around the world. The World Affairs Council of Greater Houston brings foreign affairs experts right into your home. For those new to the council, you can find this listing and so many other of our activities on our website at wsahouston.org. We would like to extend a very special welcome to members joining from different World Affairs Councils around the country. This event is part of C by C Amplified, which is an idea summit presented by World Affairs Councils nationwide and organized by the World Affairs Councils of America. This week, councils from around the United States are working together to highlight the power of our network. We encourage everyone joining us today to support your local World Affairs Councils. Now, on to our program. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, Revolutionary Lives and Enduring Legacies, with Dr. Peniel Joseph from University of Texas. Dr. Peniel Joseph is the founding director of the Lyndon B. Johnson School Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. His career focus has been on Black Power studies, which encompasses interdisciplinary fields such as Africana studies, law and society, women's and ethnic studies, and political science. In addition to being a frequent speaker on these issues, Peniel has written several award-winning books. Lastly, to present a question for today's panel, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. My colleague, Ronan O'Malley, is joining our dialogue with Dr. Joseph today. Dr. Joseph and Ronan, a virtual warm welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandia, and thank you very much to all of our members, guests, students, and teachers joining us in Houston and Texas and beyond. It's great to have you. And a very important discussion, a very important topic. This is a program we've been looking forward to for 2 or 3 months. We were supposed to host it, Peniel in Houston, but like a lot of people, it's all gone virtual. I hope to have you again. And I just want to highlight to the audience, this is an excellent, incredible book. I've read a good number of books on the subject. This is by far one of the best, the ones that I've learned the most from myself. The Sword and the Shield. If you really want to get a true feel for the lives, the legacies, and I think the real persons who actually were behind the myths and the legends of both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, this is an incredible book. Maybe just to start, Peniel, we'll get into their kind of their lives of where they went to, but in some ways, obviously Martin Luther King had a much more, I suppose, kind of blessed and kind of fortunate start in his life than Malcolm. But in some ways, they both had the similar background of both having powerful and influential fathers who were involved in the civil rights struggle that they both looked up to and idolized. And sadly, in some ways, if Malcolm's father wasn't, killed, perhaps by white terrorists, he might have had a role a bit more similar to Martin Luther King. Could you talk loosely about their lives and how they got involved in the movements themselves?
Yeah, Ronan, first, very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Malcolm and Martin, they had very different childhoods. They are both loved very much by their fathers and their mothers, but Malcolm is coming from a working class background. His father is Earl Little, his mother is Louise Little, and this is his father's second family. He's got half brothers and sisters who are from Georgia, from his father Earl's first marriage. Earl is both a farmer and an itinerant Baptist minister, and also a follower of Marcus Garvey, the Pan-African political activist of the early 20th century who founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association. So Malcolm was born May 19th, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. And when we think about Malcolm X, his early childhood before his father's passing is really a bucolic childhood. He's on a farm, there's chickens. He follows his father around, and his father is leading these UNIA meetings, these Black nationalist meetings. But his father's also a Baptist preacher. And when you think about this idea of Black nationalism, all we mean is unity, the cultural politics of race, and self-determination. And by the cultural politics of race, I mean this idea that Black is beautiful, that Black people had beauty, a history, knowledge, and a culture that was worth investigating, and that culture was connected to Africa. So when we think about Malcolm, his early years are really quite bucolic, but then his father is going to be either killed in a streetcar accident in September of 1931, or really assassinated by a group of white supremacists called the Black Legion. And we say either or because the police report says that he died in a streetcar accident and his body was nearly severed in two. Malcolm's family insists that they had received threats from the Black Legion that his father would be assassinated if he continued to organize. He continued to organize, and suddenly he's killed in this what authorities say is an accident, but Malcolm Little firmly believes is an assassination. After his father's assassination, his mother, a few years later, is going to be institutionalized in a psychiatric institution, and Malcolm's going to be in a series of foster homes from the time he is 11, 12, 13, all the way until he's 15 years old, goes to Boston, Roxbury, to live with his half-sister, his older sister, Ella Mae Collins, is the sibling he's the closest to. And really what happens to Malcolm is from 1940 to 1946, Malcolm becomes part of the criminal underworld. He is 15 years old. He's 6'3" at 15. He passes for an adult. He gets out of World War II by making a claim when he's being interviewed to the draft board that if he is drafted, he is so upset about racism and racial discrimination, he plans to organize alongside the Japanese if he's drafted. And he does this as a ruse not to get drafted, and he's disqualified as psychiatrically unable to serve in the war, right? And so we think about Malcolm X, what is he doing before he's Malcolm X? As Malcolm Little, he's selling marijuana to jazz musicians in Roxbury and in Harlem. He's working as a waiter, he's working as a Pullman car porter, but eventually he's part of a burglary ring back in Boston that gets caught after robbing a series of homes in Cambridge and other places. And he's going to be sentenced. It's an interracial burglary ring. His girlfriend at the time is Armenian. And he's going to be sentenced to 11 years in prison. He's going to serve about 77 months. And it's in prison that he meets up with the Nation of Islam. And the Nation of Islam is really a religious nationalist group. It's a group that is both anti-racist, but it's also a group that traffics in racist stereotypes about white people. It's a group that has its own mythology that's connected in some ways to Orthodox Islam, but is really an offshoot as well. And it's an offshoot of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and some of those activists who are connected. And they make an argument that there was a man from the Middle East, W.D. Fard, who founded the Nation of Islam, and Elijah Muhammad, who was formerly the Georgia sharecropper named Elijah Poole, changes his name to Elijah Muhammad, is the messenger of God. And when Malcolm joins in prison, that group only has several hundred members. By the time he leaves the group in 1965, it's going to have over 50,000 members. And the Nation of Islam is a group that talks about racial unity, self-determination, critiques Christianity as a religion of slavery, suffering, and death. And so Malcolm has that arc as he becomes this political activist, both in prison and once he's paroled from prison in 1952.
And then I think perhaps Martin Luther King's life is perhaps a bit more known, as you mentioned in the book eloquently. He's becomes an incredible orator. His father was one of the best known Black Baptist ministers in the country, and he's hoping for and is delighted when eventually his son joins him and eventually takes over the church. But I suppose getting into their kind of visions of how to address racial discrimination in the United States, could you talk about Martin Luther King's how he developed these concepts of nonviolence? Obviously he was inspired somewhat by Gandhi. He went to India, met with Prime Minister Nehru, but it was really a revolutionary concept. and one that did not have a broad track record of success across much of the world. How did he come to that, and how did he more importantly stay with it in the face of the brutal violence he faced and his followers?
Yeah, King comes through nonviolence through both the twin teachings of the Christian church, the Black social gospel, and really reading in seminary and at Morehouse and at Boston University. So he's influenced by Benjamin Mays, who's the president of Morehouse College, really the most elite school that an African-American male could go. It's an all-male school, still around today. He's tutored by Howard Thurman, who's one of the great social gospel theologians of the time. He reads up on Paul Tillich and these other religious philosophers. And really, he reads about Gandhi as well. I would say that one of the things I discussed maybe in around chapter 3 or 4 is the meeting with Bayard Rustin in 1955-56. And Bayard Rustin is the openly gay Black social democratic organizer who eventually is the principal organizer of the March on Washington in 1963. He's mentored by A. Philip Randolph, who's the most important Black labor leader in the 20th century and the founder of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And Bayard Rustin was part of groups of interracial activists and Gandhians who actually went to India, were interested in taking nonviolence, pacifism as a strategy to destroy Jim Crow in the 1940s. So Bayard Rustin had been part of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. He had been part of the Congress of Racial Equality. He was on the first Freedom Ride, which was in 1947, interracial groups of Christian, social democratic, radical activists who were nonviolent, but who defied Jim Crow laws. And Bayard was arrested. He was beaten for both defying Jim Crow laws, but also at times for violating the vagrancy laws of the 1940s and 50s that were basically laws designed to terrorize homosexuals in the United States. So Bayard meets up with King during the Montgomery bus boycott, and King has armed guards around his house because Coretta and him, his wife, have been receiving death threats. And Bayard is the one who really mentors King and schools him that Gandhian nonviolence means that you can't have guns anywhere, right? And really lets him see that it's a strategy and a tactic, but it's more than that. It's a way of life, but it's a way of life that is nonviolent, but it's also coercive and it's transformative. So King always remains nonviolent, but he definitely, and I show this in the book, he becomes more committed to the nonviolent civil disobedience that somebody like Malcolm X had called for with the March on Washington, where you could use nonviolence to basically paralyze cities, paralyze neighborhoods, communities until justice came.
And maybe moving back to Malcolm, for much of his life, sadly, and after he left the Nation of Islam, a lot of things are opening up, and we'll discuss that in a bit. And he was changing his perspectives, at least willing to consider other points of view. He had been critical of nonviolence and of people like MLK. I think a lot of ways saying that this is something that is not going to work. It's doomed to fail. But can we maybe talk about the aspect of Malcolm that I think a lot of people forget is Martin Luther King obviously had enormous influence all across the United States, especially in the South. But a lot of people forget the huge influence Malcolm had, especially in Harlem and New York, a lot of the big cities in the North. As you mentioned in the book, one of Malcolm has incredible quotes, a great wordsmith. He said, "For me, the South in the United States starts at the border of Canada." Yes. You talk about what he did to kind of revolutionize and energize, especially the working class for Blacks all across the United States, especially in the urban centers.
Yeah, absolutely. When we think about Malcolm X, Malcolm in an age before mass incarceration, but when the criminal justice system was still disproportionately impacting negatively African Americans, he is a prison activist. I mean, he becomes an activist in prison. He goes to 3 different prisons in Massachusetts, Charlestown, Concord, and Norfolk. And at Norfolk, which is an experimental prison, which provides classes and professors go and teach folks, he takes all the classes and he really has a curriculum where he's studying history, he's studying literature and Shakespeare, he's studying world religions, and he studies African-American history and racial slavery. And so as soon as he comes out of prison, August 7th, 1952, Malcolm is not just in New York and Harlem, He is in Detroit, he's in Chicago, he's in Los Angeles, he is in Boston, he's in all these major cities, and he's really trying to recruit what they call fishing in the parlance of the Nation of Islam, fish from the working class and from formerly incarcerated people who are formerly substance abusers. Nation of Islam has a big, successful program of getting people off of opioids, in this case, heroin, in the 1950s and early 60s. So he's very, very important in terms of radicalizing and making more militant aspects of the Black community that aren't necessarily interested not only in nonviolence, but who are ready for an alternative to the Black Christian church as well.
And, conversely, is it fair to say, Malcolm X would have been an incredible attorney. He's a great, or politician, a great way with words, and a great way of walking around a question or not directly stepping on a landmine. For the most part, he would condemn nonviolence and say it is going to fail, but he would usually stop short of calling for actual violence. He might say a revolution is the only thing that will change this, but is it fair to say that if he's saying nonviolence is a failure, that the corollary, the only thing that's going to succeed at the time for him was an actual call to violence?
Well, I think he's talking about self-defense, Ronan. I think that when you think about Malcolm, and I like your analogy about attorney, because I say that Malcolm is the prosecuting attorney for Black America and King is the defense attorney. And what I mean by that is that the reason why Malcolm is going to be followed by the FBI, the reason why Malcolm is under investigation, why he's perceived as this subversive, he really is Black America's prosecuting attorney in the post-war period, even in the context of the Cold War. He's accusing white America, politicians to church leaders, elected officials, law enforcement, of a series of crimes against African Americans. And, right now we all know the 1619 Project in New York Times. We're all erudite people here. That just won the Pulitzer Prize. And the 1619 Project is from racial slavery, Jamestown, Virginia, all the way to the present, 400 years. Malcolm X was talking about his own 1619 Project ad nauseum in the context of the 1950s and 60s to Black and white audiences. Remember, Malcolm has the famous analogy about King as an Uncle Tom, but saying that there were house Negroes and there were field Negroes, and that Malcolm identifies as a field Negro. The field Negroes thought that they wanted a revolution. They wanted rebellion. They were Nat Turner, right? The house Negroes so identified with white masters, Malcolm argues, that when white masters in the plantation class was sick, they would say, "Are we sick?" Right? Are we sick? Meaning that that's how much they identified. So Malcolm initially accuses King and the entire civil rights establishment, he's going to apologize, by the way, by 1964, of being part of that house Negro class. Reason why Malcolm feels he's a field Negro is that he experienced racial trauma in a different way from King. His father is murdered in his conception. His mother is institutionalized. His family is completely disintegrates until multiple members of his family join the Nation of Islam, including brothers and sisters. So what's interesting about Malcolm is that when we think about this idea of violence versus nonviolence, and what does Malcolm mean by revolution, what I argue in The Sword and the Shield is that Malcolm is the biggest proponent of radical Black dignity during the civil rights period. And Martin Luther King Jr. is the biggest proponent of radical Black citizenship. Over time, they come to see those two things and themes have to converge. Initially, they both stand pat thinking that their theme is the best theme. So for Malcolm, what radical Black dignity means is a recognition of Black humanity that is not predicated on white approval. For King, what does radical Black citizenship means? King is the defense attorney. King wants, above else, a beloved community that features what? Racial justice that is precipitated by racial rapprochement. He thinks that Blacks and whites and everybody in between need to get together, find out each other's stories, and really produce. He says that justice is what love looks like in public, which is one of King's, his amazing quotes, one of his amazing quotes. And so when we think about this idea of radical Black citizenship, King wants both an end to racial segregation and racial violence, But then he's going to say that citizenship actually means a set of prerogatives and perquisites, which mean things like guaranteed income, which means decent housing. King is against racial segregation because he thinks racial segregation separates people from resources, but also understanding. So King is trying to change hearts and minds and public policy. Malcolm is doing something different. Initially, Malcolm is saying the reason we need a revolution is precisely because Black people are human beings and haven't been recognized as such, and they shouldn't be lobbying towards anybody for that recognition, right? He's got an amazing interview with Dr. Kenneth Clark, who's the social scientist who had written up the Dahl test for the 1954 Brown decision. It's Dr. Kenneth Clark's work is why the Supreme Court voted 9-0 to desegregate public schools, because Kenneth Clark and his wife, the Dahl test they did, the little Black girl chose the white dolls consistently over a Black doll. And they made the argument that the little Black girl did that because of racial segregation and this idea of having some kind of self-loathing and sort of knowing intuitively at even 5 years old that white was the best. So the Supreme Court said, this is damaging to Black children, and so you have to have racial integration. And they cite that in the case, in the Brown 1 case. So he's being interviewed by Dr. Kenneth Clark, and they say, Dr. Clark says, well, why do you want racial separatism? Isn't that like racial segregation? And Malcolm X says, no. He says, we shouldn't have to protest Black people for racial integration because we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. We have citizenship already. Why are we having to protest? The only reason he wants racial separatism, and he has these great debates with Bayard Rustin, with James Farmer, never debates King, is because racism disallows us from integrating into the body politic. So it's a very interesting, when you really get to the nitty gritty of Malcolm X, in a lot of ways, he's much more unusual than the sound bites, much more unusual and a singular figure than the cliches we're used to.
And just for the amount of time, we're going to get to it in a little bit, but especially we'll talk about it once he has a separation from the Nation of Islam, and especially after his personal Hajj to Mecca. Can we talk about their role on the global front? I mean, they both were enormous ambassadors of not just African Americans, but in a lot of ways, Malcolm became seen as an unofficial ambassador or prime minister of Africans, plural, throughout the world. But just to take it back to Martin, can you talk about his views and his influence on the world, and really one view they both shared, and especially Martin became much stronger after Malcolm was killed, was this deep desire and the true wrongness and error and kind of horrors of colonialism and these ideas of these movements of anti-colonialism.
Yeah, I think that Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, they both are these towering figures who step on the world stage of global decolonization, and really this debate and conflict between the global North and global South, right? And much of the global South has been colonized. When we think about Africa, when we think about Asia, when we think about South America, the so-called Third World. When we think about Dr. King first goes overseas in 1957, and he goes to the former Gold Coast, which becomes Ghana. And he's there alongside Vice President Richard Nixon when Kwame Nkrumah becomes Prime Minister of Ghana in 1957. That's going to have a huge, huge impact on Dr. King. King sees Nkrumah become named Prime Minister wearing the same clothes he was wearing in prison when he had been jailed as being part of the opposition, the Convention People's Party in the Gold Coast. A couple of years later, King spends a month in India, and he's going to be around the untouchables, visit different parts of India. He meets up with Prime Minister Nehru, and he's really interested in the racial caste system in India and economic injustice and poverty. So when we think about the global stage for King, is really going to be trying to fuse anti-racism in the United States and anti-colonialism abroad. He meets up with the then president of Algeria, Ben Bella, in 1962, and they have a great talk about nonviolence on the world stage. By 1963, King is Time Magazine Man of the Year, and in 1964, he wins the Nobel Peace Prize. So he really becomes this global figure of human rights. He calls the international community, including the United States, the world house. And King, way before globalization, made an argument that we were all, the phrase he uses, a single, we're all bound in a single garment of destiny, he said, that we were all mutually connected. So when we think about King in the world, King is interested in South Africa and discusses apartheid in South Africa. King goes to London and discusses anti-colonial movements. Obviously in Oslo when he receives the Nobel Prize. So his pulpit is a global one indeed.
And then, I suppose turning, back to Malcolm, especially, as you mentioned, once he kind of got out from under the weight and the shadow of Elijah Muhammad, and really just the kind of, I suppose in a lot of ways it was more a Nation of Islam, maybe defined as a cult. It certainly was not a typical religious order. It was not a typical, Muslim collection of mosques or anything like that. But can you talk about how his time in Mecca really opened his eyes? In the book, you mentioned how he had a racial epiphany. Malcolm himself said when he came back, it was maybe the first time I felt I could, appreciate or recognize a white person.
When we think about the Nation of Islam and Malcolm, it's really complicated. I would say that the Nation, it is a religion. It's a religion that has a mixture of progressive and really backwards and reactionary ideas, right? So it traffics in both anti-racism, it traffics in racism. It traffics in the uplift of Black women. It traffics in deep misogyny and sexism against Black women. It traffics at times in critiques of capitalism and the exclusion of Black people from having access to capital to build up their own businesses. And they're very also pro-capitalist and want to build up Black businesses. The Nation of Islam becomes one of the largest Black owned holders of real estate in the United States, the Nation of Islam. So they buy farms, they buy buildings in Chicago, Arizona, Mississippi. They really become this multi-million-dollar organization that's also tax exempt because they're a religious group, right? And so what's interesting about Malcolm is that over time, the reason why Malcolm X is part of the Nation of Islam, it's like any of us who are part of whether it's the Republican or Democratic or other parties, it's to amplify his voice. He realizes very early on the problems within the Nation of Islam and the fact that the Nation of Islam has political corruption, there's sexual corruption, there's all kinds of corruption. It was in some ways similar to other organizations, in some ways dissimilar. The reason he's kicked out of the Nation of Islam in 1963 is not because Malcolm says the chickens have come home to roost in the aftermath of John F. Kennedy's assassination. It's because Malcolm is trying to politicize an organization that is very much small c conservative and is happy making now tens of millions of dollars, right? And so what happens to Malcolm is that he's silenced for 90 days. He tries to use a young boxing champ named Cassius Clay, who's going to be named Muhammad Ali, as leverage to try to get back in the organization. And this is an important anecdote because Malcolm has an office at the United Nations, which I discuss in the book. Malcolm knew African and Middle East diplomats going back to 1959. He first leaves the United States in 1959, spends 5 weeks in the Middle East, and he meets up with all kinds of people in Saudi Arabia, in Cairo, in other places. But one of the people he meets up with is the vice president of Egypt, who's Anwar el-Sadat, who becomes the president of Egypt later on. And so Malcolm has these ties to Cuban diplomats, to different embassies all around the world. He introduces those people to Cassius Clay, and Elijah Muhammad sees what's happening, and he gives Cassius Clay the name Muhammad Ali to break up that relationship and to break up that friendship, right? And so when we think about Malcolm, by the time he goes on the Hajj pilgrimage, the Nation of Islam has really stripped him of everything, including his friendship with Muhammad Ali. And Muhammad Ali, if he had gone with Malcolm X, could have actually bankrolled his efforts to do new organizations, which included the Muslim Mosque Organization and the Organization of Afro-American Unity. So by the time he goes overseas, though, the Hajj is very important. He has an epiphany, but I would argue that he realized that the Nation of Islam was trafficking in a kind of anti-white racism very early on, still uses the platform for his own reasons. He has to manufacture a very public epiphany through postcards, which he does in April and May. And he says, he comes back and says that, hey, white people can be part of the solution as long as they're willing to recognize and advocate for Black dignity.
And as you highlight so well in the book, probably one of the greatest ironies is the greatest champions for Black dignity, for Black pride, for basically Black independence, was not killed by a Ku Klux Klan or some people like that. He was killed by people basically under orders, whether direct or not, from the Nation of Islam itself. But maybe could you talk about that last year? A lot of people see as most pivotal year of what he was doing and where he was going, besides the fact that he was mending bridges with MLK and other civil rights leaders and kind of being willing to accept a broader, more open view of how to address racial change.
Yeah, he's doing all of it. The last year is an extraordinary year. He's trying to connect with civil rights activists, including Martin Luther King Jr. They had their first and only meeting March 26, 1964 at the U.S. Senate. They're both witnessing the Senate filibuster, the Civil Rights Act. Malcolm X sits down for an interview with Robert Penn Warren, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author for a book, Who Speaks for the Negro, that would be published the next year. And he says that him and King have the same goals. They just have different tactics. He writes telegrams to Dr. King, invites him to different events. Dr. King's lawyer, Clarence Jones, tries to organize a meeting for both of them. That doesn't come off. On the global stage, Malcolm goes away from April to May and then July all the way to November 21st. And what he does overseas is really try to connect his new group, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, with African liberation movements. And this idea of connecting anti-racist civil rights activism in the United States with anti-colonial activism abroad. He's also preaching this idea of not a civil rights movement, but a human rights movement. He's trying to organize an effort to charge the United States with crimes against Black humanity in the United Nations as well, right? And that was something that African Americans had tried to do in the 1940s and early 50s, William Patterson and others. So Malcolm is really very much trying to lead, and he's very impressed by Billy Graham, not Billy Graham's politics, but Billy Graham's crusade, this crusade for global racial justice. But one of the interesting things we see with the evolution is the speech, The Ballad or the Bullet, because The Ballad or the Bullet is a speech in 1964 in March and April and May. One of his most famous speeches, probably the two most famous speeches, are The Ballad and the Bullet and Message from the Grassroots. And he argues in that speech that voting rights and democratic institutions actually do matter. And this is really an evolution because he had pushed back against that. And really in December of 1964, and this whole idea of the ballot or the bullet is this idea that, and Frederick Douglass is the first person who had used that in a speech in the 1860s. Frederick Douglass, the great African-American abolitionist, and who had met with Lincoln 3 times and is really the foremost civil rights activist of the period of antebellum slavery and right after. What Malcolm means by the ballot or the bullet is this idea that if there isn't Black citizenship and dignity, there is going to be more racial violence. And he's really speaking in the context of Birmingham had exploded in 63, Harlem had exploded in 64, and we're going to see these summers of urban rebellion, civil disturbances, race riots from 63 all the way through 68.
And you mentioned in the book, probably one of the most profound impacts a lot of people don't think about is following the assassination of Malcolm, who was actually 4 years older than Martin Luther King. A lot of people don't realize Malcolm's so kind of fiery and kind of energetic that it's surprising he's actually 4 years older than Malcolm. But could you talk about how that influenced Martin Luther King and maybe helped him realize that what we've done and accomplished is something as impressive, but there's so much more to do, and maybe just a pure simplified movement is not enough, And also, I think you wisely point out that Malcolm highlighted the fact that Martin might not have realized at the time, that this is a much bigger issue. This is institutionalized racism. This is a legal system that's flawed. This is a police system that's flawed. Can you talk about the influence of Malcolm, even in death, upon Martin?
Yeah, the last two chapters, Ronan, are called The Radical King and The Revolutionary King. And you really see King evolve, right? I think in a lot of ways, both of these men served in the 1950s and 60s as each other's alter ego. And I think once you lose Malcolm, and if you think of that as good cop, bad cop, and once you lose the bad cop, King really has to evolve, and he really becomes from this caterpillar into a butterfly through 65, 66, 67, 68. I think Watts is a big deal. The urban rebellion in Watts, Los Angeles, which occurs a few days after the signing of the Voting Rights Act by Lyndon Baines Johnson. Watts is important for us because just like the Black Lives Matter movement in our contemporary context grows out of frustration with police brutality, Watts really occurs and is ignited by an incident between police and a local residents of South Central Los Angeles. And that's really a middle-class neighborhood, racially segregated, but it was by no means what people might call the ghetto or think of as the ghetto. And it's going to have a whole week of just rebellion and conflagration. King is going to cut short a vacation to fly in there, and he's going to say to Bayard Rustin and others that without economic justice and trying to really substantively transform the living and the material conditions, especially of the poorest Black people, what people might call a racial underclass, none of this legislation is going to matter. So when we think about King starting in 65, he's even writing, and I discuss it in the book, he's saying that there's all these mayors who embraced him and politicians after he won the Nobel Peace Prize. But when he says that, hey, we need to desegregate public housing in neighborhoods, no one wants to speak to it. When he says we need civilian control over police and have police being reviewed for allegations of police brutality and killing Black folks, no one wants to listen. So he becomes really a pillar of fire, like one of his biographers says, and he's this man on fire across the country. By 66, he moves to Chicago full time, takes on the daily machine, lives in really slum housing, visits with gangs, and really starts getting into the nitty gritty by 65, 66. And he starts to talk to the same people Malcolm used to talk to. And this is very interesting because King always talked to poor people, but he talked to poor Black sharecroppers and not necessarily poor people who had gone to prison. And so he's talking to people who've been to prison. He talks to young people who don't understand what nonviolence is, haven't been formally educated, but are burning with rage or burning with anger over what's happening in the United States. And this is the 1960s. This is 1960s. So King becomes a very, very radical figure. And the summer of 66 is very interesting because Stokely Carmichael, who's a young activist who King has known for several years and has been part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, he unleashes the phrase Black Power in June 16th, 1966 in Greenwood, Mississippi. And King critiques the phrase, but he never disavows Stokely or Black Power activists. He marches shoulder to shoulder with them in Mississippi, in Chicago, and other places. So even as while we see the Black Power movement flourish and groups like the Black Panthers might call King and Uncle Tom, he never responds in kind because he makes the argument that rioting is the language of the unheard and that we need to have a society that is, what King argues, true to what it put down on paper. And he's talking about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So King becomes this real, very, very interesting figure. By 67, April 4th, 1967, that's when I argue he becomes a revolutionary in the last year of his life. He comes out against the Vietnam War at the Riverside Church and the Beyond Vietnam War speech. He really makes this very interesting case that the United States will never live up to its democratic potential as long as it engages in perpetual war overseas and racism and racial discrimination at home. But he also says that the country is too materialistic. He says its militarism, racism, and materialism are the triple threats. He calls them the triple evils facing humanity and the United States. So it's very, very profound. Some people love it. Dr. Benjamin Spock, Harry Belafonte, the peace movement, they really, in some ways, some people say, well, King becomes a diminished figure by the end. in terms of polling, they're right, especially white Americans who are polled. His high point is 1964, right? And remember, the two speeches that most white Americans, including presidents Johnson and Kennedy, saw King deliver on national television: March on Washington, August 28, 1963, and then the Selma speech, the Selma to Montgomery speech, March 25th, 1965. But that's it. So most people, don't constantly hear King. They just hear sound bites, right? By 67, 68, the speeches are much tougher than those speeches. These are speeches talking about white racism, white violence producing chaos, and then saying because of the chaos that it's produced, that there won't be any anti-racist policies until there's peace, even though they're unleashing the chaos. He's talking about structural violence. He really gets down into the depth, the granular details of race and racism and power relations. And people who are influenced by him are going to be people like Marion Wright Edelman, who later founds the Children's Defense Fund. Bobby Kennedy is somebody who's very much going to be influenced by him. The later Bobby Kennedy, who runs for president and is tragically assassinated on June 5th, 1968. So he becomes, on one level, he's polling less, but he's knitting together an even bigger coalition, right? And we see that with the Poor People's Campaign, where he's knitting together Native Americans, and he's meeting with Native American, Mexican American, poor whites. He's got a critique of capitalism. King is definitely a social democrat and had always been, but it doesn't come out. So he believes in democracy, but a social democrat in the sense of a safety net. He talks about that after leaving Oslo. He's floored by Scandinavian social democracy and says that this is what we need in the United States to have justice for all people. And so he really becomes this really big time prophetic figure. But again, there's no more meetings with the White House. There's no more conversations with Lyndon Johnson, because he's making an argument that the Great Society needs more ambition, and you can't spend tens of billions of dollars in Vietnam and less than $1 billion a year on the anti-poverty. And he's right, but politically he becomes toxic in terms of mainstream America. And remember, places like the New York Times, which are later going to fet Dr. King, attack and assault him after he comes out against the Vietnam War.
And just for the sake of time, I want to turn to, because there's so much to discuss, audience questions. You noted it, obviously, a lot of ways, both Malcolm and Martin both came to points where they realized, in the bigger, broadest sense, poverty, inequality, those are the biggest issues that are condemning. That has a bigger effect upon Black people in the United States and at other issues. But if those aren't addressed, this system is broken and it's going to continue to afflict a certain number of people. Seamus asks, you mentioned Black capitalism. Will a capitalist system always leave Black communities shortchanged or underdeveloped? Or is there a viable option to work within the system?
That's a great question. I think that the capitalist system, and as defined by both Malcolm and Martin, it was really, and scholars use the term racial capitalism. And by that, they just mean that ever since racial slavery, the kind of system of capitalism we've had is a system that basically exploits and commodifies Black bodies, both in life and in death, right? And this will include everything from enslaved Africans to the aftermath of racial slavery, the convict lease system, all the way up to mass incarceration, sports, athletics now, right? And so if you could get away from a capitalist system that racializes bodies and sort of exploits those bodies, perhaps, but we've just never had a system that wasn't based on that. And when you say racial capitalism, you can say capitalism has historically been gendered too. That this system exploits women's work, it exploits their value in ways that marginalize them from maximizing their potential, right? And so, potentially yes, but we certainly haven't seen that system. So it's not a fair and square system. And this is connected to the idea of saying, look, we have also monopoly capitalism in terms of certain monopolies have a competitive advantage over just small business people. But when it comes to Black people having access to sort of an unfettered neutral capitalism, we just haven't seen it. It would be interesting to see, because you'd be interested to see how does that shake out if everybody did have a fair shake.
And maybe a question to bring it into the modern era. I suppose, as you mentioned, gender issues, the capitalism and racial issues. We've had our first African American president. Doesn't mean we're in a post-racial country. And if Hillary had won the election, we wouldn't have a post-sexist country either. Could you talk about, someone asked, and what have you learned from studying, Phoebes asked, what have you learned from studying the lives of Malcolm X and MLK that is applicable to America today? And just to loop it into someone else's question, how would they see or kind of look at the Black Lives Matter movement?
Yeah, I think their lives are hugely, especially in the context of the pandemic and continued racial segregation. And we can see, basically, when we think of how does racism look in the contemporary period, Black people, Latinx folks are disproportionately overrepresented in negative social economic indicators. And that's everything from poverty to their children having asthma and having being exposed to asbestos and bad drinking water, opportunity gaps in terms of education, living in segregated places, food hunger, food deserts, incarceration, just a number of things, and being underrepresented in all the positive social economic indicators. So that means those of us who during the pandemic have had access to continue to work from home, continue to get a good paycheck, we might have wealth or assets. We have retirement funds beyond Social Security. We might own multiple houses. We're legacies who have gone to college for multiple generations. We might have access to elite generations and elite networks. So that's what we mean. And just health, we have childcare, we have elder care. We can take time off. We can go on vacation, including European vacations and trips abroad and overseas. So that's what we need. And so that legacy continues. And so their push for human rights, a beloved community, radical dignity and citizenship continues in our own time. And when you think about BLM, I think that they both would have agreed. I think that BLM connects Malcolm's structural critique with King's nonviolent civil disobedience. They make an argument that the criminal justice system in the United States is a gateway to multiple systems of panoramic oppression that we continue to see just in our day in and out lives, everyday lives. And I think that BLM has also tried to push for different policy changes and transformations that King and then eventually Malcolm were actually interested in. They're both interested in policy and sort of lobbying governments, both domestic and international, for change.
And just for the sake of time, because I know, thank you, Peniel, for joining us. I know you have another live Zoom webinar with someone else, I think, out of California here shortly. Yes. But maybe a last question from the audience. I think you could talk about MLK's relationships with. Could you talk about? It says Marianne asks, can you speak to the relationship of MLK and LBJ and how it contributes to the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964?
Yeah, they have a very good relationship between 1963 and I would say 1965. Lyndon Johnson becomes president around 1 o'clock, November 22nd, 1:30 after 1963, after Kennedy's assassination. He immediately meets up with Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders. I think throughout 1964 and 65, LBJ cultivates a relationship with King. They speak on the phone. We have this from White House tapes and other archives. They're working with each other, even though King is trying to push Lyndon Baines Johnson. Johnson definitely is a supporter of civil rights, a supporter of voting rights, but he's a supporter within the context of thinking this is an important issue, but I've got many important issues, including Vietnam, which starts to take more and more of his time, especially after 1965. So they have a very good relationship, but King becomes dismayed that the war on poverty and the Great Society basically really does become dismantled by the Vietnam War. Because if the Great Society had spent in that 5-year period that Lyndon Johnson was president, the amount of money that was spent on Vietnam domestically, it would have been a game changer for the country. It would have been a game changer for the country. So if the Congress had passed that money, if the president had pushed, and so that relationship eventually fractures, but no, it's a strong relationship. And I would say the time it's the strongest is also when Lyndon Johnson's presidency is the strongest. And I'd probably say the high point is not just the passage of the Voting Rights Act, August 6, 1965, it's also Lyndon Johnson's Howard University commencement address on June 4th, 1965, where he talks about affirmative action. He talks about Black people. You can't have a runner who's been shackled and expect him to run the race the same distance as the runner who hasn't been shackled for centuries of oppression. And he says, we don't want just equality of opportunity. We want equality as a fact and results, right? And in a way, when you think about LBJ, that's him at his high point. These sort of, even though they're very violent years, but they're sort of magical years of 63, 64, 65.
Yeah, and I suppose maybe just lastly on LBJ, I think you note in the book, I think it was after that speech, how Martin himself was actually moved to tears that he finally felt an American president was seeing this as a core and vital issue of equality and just humanity.
Absolutely, yes, that's a high point for LBJ. And unfortunately, like, Vietnam really becomes the bear that really undermines the LBJ presidency and really undermines where the country goes, because we stay in that conflict till 1975, even though the Pentagon Papers, Daniel Ellsberg, we know that we knew very early it was a stalemate and we could not win without unleashing nuclear war, and we weren't going to do that primarily because China would have had something to say about that.
And lastly, maybe just in conclusion, thank you again for your time, but not at all to take away anything from the civil rights era, but what was addressed largely through the civil rights, acts of the 1960s and the work done before that, or the Supreme Court cases, were addressing the structural kind of institutionalized and obvious forms of racism. Where we are today as a society in the United States and beyond, how concerned are you about the issues of racism that still exist, and perhaps the underlying issues as well that's still there that both Malcolm and Martin discussed and highlighted, the issues of class separation and classism? Where do you think we are as a country, and are you concerned, or what do you think we should do?
Yeah, no, I'm very, very concerned. I think that we see with the 2013 Supreme Court decision, Shelby v. Holder, we took a major step back in terms of voting rights. I live in a state, Texas, where there's a lot of voter suppression, and we've seen voter suppression just nationally throughout the United States. We're having less access to the polls, and that's something that was a hallmark of the Jim Crow system from Reconstruction all the way up into the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And we're also just seeing a perpetuation through both the legal system, but also local municipalities, of public school segregation. So the high point of desegregating public schools is 1988. According to the scholar Gary Orfield at UCLA, who's the top expert on this. And really, that's been a series of court decisions, but also elected officials as well, who've even pushed back and taken support away from consent decrees, communities that actually want to racially integrate their schools. And certainly the Roberts Court and the Parents versus Teachers decision, 2007, has done the same thing. So we're in trouble in terms of both structural racism, but also we think about violence that's just happening against African Americans, vigilante violence in the United States as well. So the COVID pandemic has shown the structural inequalities in terms of healthcare disparities. Who are the public-facing workers who are going to be most exposed? Black communities that are connected to the civil rights movement, like Albany, Georgia, where Dr. King spent Christmas, really almost Christmas in 1961, just protesting against segregation. They've had 125 COVID deaths, over 1,500 people testing positive for COVID. This has happened in Detroit. This has happened in New York City. And so we're seeing density, vulnerability continue. I think the progress that we've seen is really, Ronan, archipelagos of progress that were really highlighted by President Obama. They're highlighted by, Michelle Obama, Oprah Winfrey. We've got the documentary on Michael Jordan being played. Tiger Woods won the Masters again after 10 years. So there's certainly progress, but these are bubbles. And I think that the world that King and Malcolm were trying to build was really eventually this beloved community where I guess even they wanted all this injustice to be completely eradicated or so greatly diminished that it came down and boiled down to a problem that we felt was solvable. I think this problem is just growing and growing. And that inequity is growing in the United States and globally, as we've seen. But I think the positive, and I'll end this on an optimistic note, is that they left us with the blueprints for what we need to do in terms of dignity and citizenship, and this push for human rights and certain social movements. And it's not just Black Lives Matter; it's movements for the rights of immigrants, it's movements for the rights of LGBTQ, it's the women's marches, it's movements to stop the xenophobia and movements to stop anti-Muslim and just othering of people. Those movements have really amplified what they call for. So now we realize that there are people who are queer and very proud of it, who are trans and proud of it, people who've got mental or some kind of non-able-bodiedness. We've gotten into the weeds, so to speak, in a way that gets some people very uncomfortable. I think it's great because our identities shape our politics, right? But there's something universal about the human experience. And both of these activists, I would argue, were trying to talk about universal rights, but through the particular lens of Black struggle. And if we ever get to a point of connecting justice through that lens, it really will reverberate out to different communities that right now are really in trouble, and we're seeing the depth and breadth of the trouble and the vulnerability they're in.
Well, thank you very much, Peniel. And before we go, I might just also remind the audience, if you'd like to join us next Wednesday, we'll be hosting a program on the global refugee crisis, a live webinar with David Miliband, who's the president and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, or IRC. And again, thank you all for joining us, and a special thank you again to Dr. Peniel Joseph on an enlightening, illuminating, and timely talk with regards to race, basically the civil rights era, but also where we are today, and the incredible lives and impacts of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And I highly suggest you go out and buy his excellent book, The Sword and the Shield. I think you'll find it fascinating, and you'll all learn a lot. Thank you all again for joining us, and thank you so much, Dr. Joseph. Thank you.
Thank you.